The conversion of Paul is powerful evidence for the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. He says, Paul, a servant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ. Now stop right there. Paul tells us his name, right? And then he says, you need to know two things about me. Number one, I am a servant of God. Number two, I am an apostle. Apostle means a sent one, a messenger of. I am an apostle of Jesus, who is the Christ, the Messiah, the Savior, the chosen one. Now, this is a wild thing to hear come out of the mouth of Paul, or out of the pen of Paul. Because earlier in Paul's life, if you would have asked Paul to introduce himself, he might have said something like this. Okay, my name is Paul. I'm a servant of God, and I am an enemy of Jesus, who is not the Christ, who is a liar and a fraud. Because earlier in Paul's life, he was convinced that Christianity, they didn't call it Christianity, they called it the way at that time, but he was convinced that Christianity was a disease, that it was poisoning Judaism, that it was leading the people of Israel astray into false worship. And Paul saw himself as God's tool, God's instrument. I am going to snuff this infant church out before it can even get started. I'm going to rescue God's people and return us to the true worship of Yahweh. And so he went around persecuting Christians, shutting things down. But along the way, while he was doing that, something happened to Paul that changed his mind. And he went from a persecutor of Christians to an enemy, from an enemy of Jesus, to a follower, to a believer, to the kind of believer that was willing to get on a boat and go somewhere to tell some somebodies that Jesus was who he claimed to be. Now listen, the thing that Paul would say changed his mind is the resurrection of Jesus. The Apostle Paul would say, hey, the thing that did it for me, that opened my eyes, was I met Jesus alive after he was crucified. And you need to know this. The conversion of Paul is powerful evidence for the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. Because like in historical terms, right? Like if you were to look at a historical record, right? Let's say that, and I'm making this up, let's say you've got some record of a scribe, right? He was the scribe of a king. Right, and the scribe wrote something like, our king is the greatest king that has ever done any kinging. And he's the most brilliant military general that has ever lived. And he is the most handsome king that has ever lived, right? A historian might pick up that document and look at it and read it and think, okay, there might be like a core of some historical truth here, but there's also the potential for some bias, right? I mean, the scribe is in the king's court. He wants to stay in the king's good graces, right? But now let's say you uncover a second historical document, and this document is authored by a general from a rival kingdom. And the general writes something like, oh, I despise this king. Talking about the other king, right? People say he's so handsome, but I don't think that at all. But I do have to admit, he's a really good general. He really is a brilliant military tactician. Now, in that case, a historian would look at that document and say, okay, well, there's clearly no case for, but if an enemy were to say, admit, right? He has no reason, but he admits, oh gosh, he really is a brilliant military general. Maybe there's something to that. And that's what you have in the Apostle Paul. You have an enemy who changed his mind. He was convinced that Jesus was a liar and that Christianity was a disease, and something changed his mind. And when you ask him what did it, he said it was the resurrection of Jesus. The conversion of Paul is powerful evidence for the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus.